one important thing to consider with business is the long cyclical nature of it. And if you look back far enough, you can see how that plays out in terms of recessions and economic downturns and the boom and bust that goes through the process. And if you enter the market and you've not seen that before, it's not until you really experience it that you understand what it involves, and therefore how you build contingencies and build companies with resilience that are able to weather those storms. And I entered the workforce around 25 years ago, and at the time there was a lot of bullish behaviour, a lot of optimism in the market, and house prices were rising and people's incomes were rising and disposable income was rising, and companies were operating in that sort of environment, and you just assume that's always going to be the way that it is, until we got to 2008, and in America there was a subprime mortgage crisis, and that bled through into a global banking crisis and a credit crunch, as it was called. And so for a couple of years there, and with longer repercussions, there was a very different operating environment. And the companies that are prepared for that and that had people who were long enough in the tooth or who were wise enough to actually see how these things tend to play out, had provisions in place, had contingencies, had working capital positions and diversification and hedging and other plans in place, which meant that they were able to weather that, whereas some companies weren't. And I think going forward, there's a real case for building resilience into companies like never before, because we've now seen, since the early 2010s, certainly here in the UK, I've been working overseas, but here I see the Brexit vote and the political turmoil that brought, and whatever your politics may be, it's uncertainty which markets don't like, and that creates volatile trading conditions. Beyond that, then you've got war in Ukraine, you've got COVID, you've got now war in the Middle East, and you've got the overarching challenge of our times with climate change and overconsumption. So I think that going forward, as well as this sort of the end of the cycle in terms of the transition of world powers around the world and a shifting power dynamic in terms of the greater nations of the world and where the power sits. So I think there's going to be uncertainty in the markets for the foreseeable future, and the second half of my working life is probably going to be played out in a much more uncertain backdrop than perhaps the first half was, even though that did have a lot of turmoil itself. So the case for building a resilient company rather than just purely a lean and efficient one could never have been stronger.